hello, congratulations on the publication of your novel.
Thank you, Jodi.
This is actually Pub Day, right?
Yes, today's the day.
Happy Pub Day.
Thank you.
So I wanted to begin tonight by telling the story of how you and I met, because
Yes.
I think it's actually relevant to this conversation. Will you read the first two paragraphs and the last paragraph?
I don't know what she's handing me.
I'm going to give you the headline. The headline is from September 16th, 2017, almost a year ago.
Okay.
And this is an opinion piece that you wrote in the New York Times. And the headline is, Amber Tamblyn, I'm done with not being believed.
And you want me to read that? Okay.
Yeah, and then the ending too.
When I was 21, I went into the office of a producer of the television show I was starring in to discuss a big problem. By this point, I had been acting for more than a decade, and the show was very successful and beloved. Still, I was nervous about facing the firing squad of Emmys that sat behind him and saying what I had to say. A crew member had kept showing up to my apartment after work unannounced, going into my trailer while I wasn't in it, and staring daggers at me from across the set. I liked him at first. He was very sweet and kind in the beginning. We flirted a bit on set, but I was in a relationship. And liking someone certainly didn't merit the kind of behavior he was exhibiting, which was making me feel unsafe.
And then will you read the ending? So the piece goes on to talk about the importance of women speaking up. And then please read the ending for us.
The women I know, myself included, are done though, playing the credentials game. We are learning that the more we open our mouths, the more we become a choir. And the more we are a choir, the more the tune is forced to change.
And so Megan Toohey and I are reading this opinion piece published by your very own newspaper on the 4th floor of the New York Times. And this is 3 weeks, it turned out, before we published the Weinstein story. So we were in the final stages. And the big question on our minds was, were women going to speak out?
Yeah.
Were women going to going to be believed? So we read this op-ed, and we didn't know you, but we said, it almost felt like before an avalanche, like the first rocks falling off. And to us, it was a sign of hope. It was a sign of saying, maybe this thing is actually going to work. Maybe we're really going to be able to publish the story and get these allegations out there after all of these years. And maybe the cultural moment is kind of ripe for something to happen. And then, of course, I reached out to you and I called you privately, and you've been very helpful in our work. But I was going back to this piece in my mind as I read your novel, and I wanted to ask you, where does this stand relative to the book I have in my lap? At the point at which you wrote this piece, how far along were you in your book and in your kind of thinking about this issue?
It's a great question. The seed of this book was planted in like middle to late 2015. And I started writing at the end of 2015. And most of its meat, I would say, was written during the election year, during 2016. So pretty far before it. And by the time I had written this, I think I was making like final edits to the first pass of the book before I had turned it into HarperCollins.
Got it.
Yeah.
And so when you wrote, what do you think it was about you and was it your past history, or maybe sort of you picking up clues in the culture? What about this issue of assault do you think kind of drew you to it and made you so sensitive to these issues, both as they were playing out in the real world and then made you write a fictional book about them as well?
So I think that pretty much everything that I've ever done artistically, creatively, has been very empathic and revolves around understanding our interior lives better, whether it's my own interior life or someone that, that I don't know or that I haven't had the same experience as. And I think that you know, rage has been in the zeitgeist for all of us for a long time. I mean, dating back to the Roman Empire. We can go back to the history of silencing women and being forced to be quiet in a myriad of ways. And to me, you know, things that I had been interested in, things that I had wanted to write about or even direct or produce or just look at from a different lens were aiming towards that. And I think that the election was for me at least, was like, you know, the pulling of a pin out of a grenade that had just been sort of sitting in front of all of us for a really long time. And I think collectively everyone was just like, who's going to pull the pin? Who's going to pull the pin? And then all of us pulled the pin at the same time. That's what it felt like to me, because for me at least it happened in this singular year, like right around 2016 and a little bit of 2017. And that op-ed was really just sort of the cherry on top of what I'd been feeling.
But it sounds like most of this book was written before the Access Hollywood tape came out, right?
Oh yeah, it was. It was shortly before that, but there were things. The Access Hollywood thing, I can't remember if that came before or after. You know, and I should just be transparent and say that I campaigned heavily for Hillary. I was extremely pregnant. I went to over 30 states for her. Yeah, I do deserve an applause. I co-ran her youth outreach program in 2008 with America Ferrera, so I have deeply admired her for a very long time. So this was a particular kind of pain that was different. This last election, I think, as most of us would agree, was something outside of the realm of traditional politics and tapped into a systemic problem about the inequality of women and women's representation in the world. And so I think it was a catalyst for many things, and you know, it likely informed some of the book, though I haven't really thought about it that much.
Because the Access Hollywood tape came out very, very late in that election. It came out about a month before election day.
The thing that I remember, the trigger for me that sent me over the edge, was one of the debates, one of the middle or the last debate, I think, when Donald Trump brought out the women that Bill Clinton had affairs with, and sort of Rudy Giuliani was trying to get them placed to sit in front of her like some kind of firing squad. And I have a real no tolerance policy for women having to answer for the actions of their husbands. I think it lies deeply and systemically in a type of patriarchal misogyny that needs to be deconstructed and looked at. Women can answer for their own shit, that's for sure. And women are culpable, and women are capable of being cruel and monstrous and terrible, but that's what they should answer for, not for the person that they're standing next to. And so that changed me. That moment really changed me. And I had a girl growing inside of me, and I thought, what is happening? And you know, looking at it and being, something definitely I think was building in me in that point. And I had already been in the middle of writing that book. I mean, I was halfway through it at that point. But I think for me, you know, starting out as a child actress, starting out when I was 11 years old in the business and working all the way up through my industry, through the entertainment business, it all became sort of cumulative. And the election became cumulative. And, you know, the actions of Donald Trump became cumulative with the actions of a Harvey Weinstein, of a James Woods, of, you know, any person that I had ever worked with that represented that sort of demented abuse of power. And, you know, a lot of the writing of this book was how can we resensitize people to look at this from where we sit? How is that possible?
So you made a fascinating decision in this book, which is that you wrote a book about rape and assault. I should say it's kind of a funny book about rape and assault, if that makes any sense. It's also,
I know you guys. You think it's not possible. It is.
There are parts of it that are unbelievably painful to read, and then there are parts, I'm going to ask you to read one soon, that I thought were a very effective and funny satire of the culture. But you did a really interesting thing, which is that the most predictable thing in the world would be to cast a man as the rapist, and you didn't. The very terrifying rapist in this book is actually a woman, and the book is a sort of extended act of role reversal, which is not to say that men don't get raped in reality. Of course they do.
They do.
But what you're doing feels like more of a gesture. It seems like you're trying to make a point that by reversing the way we usually think about this problem, you're trying to show us something and wake us up to something. So will you talk a little bit about that decision to make the woman the rapist and what you were trying to do?
So I don't think it's so much, I don't look at it as so much as reversing as broadening the periphery of the conversation. And to me, there are many things happening at once. My attempt was to have many things happening at once in the conversation of the book. So if we're going to talk about inequality, if we're going to talk about changing systemic, endemic problems about rape culture, about the term culture, the word culture in that term, then we have to be inclusive in that. And so we have to look very broadly, and we have to consider people that are also being sexually assaulted and violated outside of the definition of woman. And to me, what that does is it helps to sort of take away the numbness from the conversation of rape, which I think as a culture we've become very numb to because we hear it, and certainly I know men are numb to it, and it's the reason I feel like 6 months after the Me Too movement that we're hearing about backlashes and we've gone too far, and all of these sort of problematic conversations. So my hope was that it sort of gave a look at the broader lens of who exactly is being sexually assaulted and how exactly is it happening, and to look at that under a bigger lens, while also taking all of the archetypes, all of the tropes, all of the cliches about the ugliness of women, and combining them, which are, by the way, definitions that are not created by us. They are assigned to us by culture, by predominantly men, by patriarchal society. And when I talk about patriarchal society, I'm not talking necessarily just about men, I'm talking about power structures, because women also do it to other women. And taking those things and combining them and creating what I felt to be an exact projection of what society believes that we are, that women in positions of power, whether we like them or not, whether they're Hillary Clinton or Ann Coulter, how do we change and create almost this anthropomorphized creature out of women? What is the folklore behind that creature? And Maud is her name in the book, exemplifies all of that. She is ugly on the inside and out. She is terrifying. The only piece of serological evidence that they find is a 6-foot-long white hair. She's mythical. And I wanted to really also say, what does it look like to have a violent woman who's had no consequences, a female predator who has no consequences?
And men who are incredibly vulnerable.
Yes.
For me as a reader, the effect of the role reversal was in part to make me feel so protective of these men and their bodies in particular, because their bodies are menaced and attacked in some very scary ways in this book, and their pain is so great, and hearing them go through their own versions, as you say, of the things we've heard many, many times from rape survivors saying.
And I don't think men, by the way, have the space in the society as well to talk about masculinity. I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but part of the aim of the book also was to say, what does the inside of men look like? Like, what do they think about? How do they feel even when they're not expressing how they feel? What have they also been burdened with in a certain sense?
Well, part of the mental game, though, I think, of reading the book is it made me think of the classic feminist text, Gloria Steinem's If Men Could Menstruate. Was that on your mind at all when you read this?
It was not, no.
Does everybody in the room know Gloria Steinem's If Men Could Menstruate? It's it's like a thought exercise and a bit of a satire. And without trying to quote it verbatim, it goes something like, if men could menstruate, tampons would be free. There would be, national, there would be, coming of age rituals, for when girls get their period, for the first time. There would be, national,
There'd be blood all over the streets.
I'm, red and proud of it.
There would be statues of tampons erected.
Celebrations, exactly. And this book made me think of that because it made me say, do we have to do this gender reversal in a way as a mental exercise to examine our own selves? And how would the way we think about rape and assault actually be different if men were the primary victims? I mean, how do you think it would be?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think...
Can we imagine, I went to college during the era of Take Back the Night marches. Can you imagine Take Back the Night marches filled with hundreds of... Can we imagine the campus sexual assault debate with Take Back the Night marches filled with quadrangles of hundreds of really vulnerable feeling 19-year-old men? Can we imagine sending our sons to college and saying to them, never accept a drink from somebody you don't know, only take a drink that you've poured yourself?
Yeah, that alcohol is the main contributor to rape, not actions.
No, but what I mean is, can you, how do you think it would actually change the way we talk about
I see.
these issues? Do you think that the way we talk about rape is so tied either to feminism or is so colored by sexism that it would be different in a way if
it does affect by a large margin women. So I think that there is only sort of one way sometimes that it can be talked about, if talked about at all. And, one of the things about this to me was to think how, we've been able to sort of show men what it's like, but how do we make them feel what it's like? And that sort of reciprocity of emotion and connection seems to be lost in a lot of the conversation. And I don't know another way to get them to know what it feels like. The feel part is really, really hard to transcribe and to interpersonally connect them to. And this was one of the ways I thought that it could be done, was to say that men who read this book, and they've told me that they've read it and they've thought either a couple of things like, well, this seems a little exaggerated. And then, for instance, there's a whole section that's kind of like a Nancy Grace segment, and they said, this seems a little over the top. And I told a friend of mine who had read it that I actually took the direct transcript between a prosecutor and Nancy Grace talking about the Stanford rape trial and Jane Doe. It's on YouTube, you can find it. And I wrote it verbatim in the book, and I switched the gender pronoun. And that's all it is. It's that simple.
I think it's a ripe time for talking about these gender role reversals, because I think one point that's been made a lot we're now in something like week 37 or week 38 of the Me Too movement, is that there have been some men who have said, this whole thing has put me in such an uncomfortable situation, and I don't know what to say in the office anymore. I don't know whether it's okay to, hug my female colleague or tell her that I like her dress, and, I'm really worried that people are going to misconstrue my actions, and I feel kind of insecure and nervous about this, or maybe sort of defensive. And I think some women have said, welcome to my world. That's the way women have felt in the workplace for a really long time, and part of the dynamic of what's going on now is sharing that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, have you read another novel that came out recently called The Power by Naomi Alderman? I hear some murmurs in the room. Do we see any hands? Yeah, a couple of
called
people
Women in Power, but no.
have read it. So I'll tell you why I'm asking, because it is also a richly imagined role reversal book, and it's a little more sort of sci-fi dystopian than yours, but it's this beautifully imagined, very gripping book in which women discover this latent power that they've had for a long time, and it comes out during puberty, and they have this electrical charge that runs kind of along their collarbone, and it's very powerful, and they develop kind of the ability to zap, to zap people. And so basically what happens is that all of womankind within the space of a couple of years assumes a kind of physical dominance over men. And then I don't want to ruin what happens in the book, but that plays out, and that plays out, and that plays out in very dramatic ways, in a way that's not completely dissimilar from the way you wrote. And I think maybe part of the reason why you're not the only one right now who needs to go through that mental exercise is that women and men are more equal than ever, and the genders are converging, right?
100%, yeah.
You know, combat roles in the military are being integrated. That means that there is less of a gap than ever before between what women do and what men do, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe what we're due for is a kind of whole genre of, you know, gender reversal or gender convergence narratives in which we kind of need to think through this question of, you know, obviously the question of what gender even means has been an area of hot debate for a long time, but what do these designations even really mean anymore? And maybe to sort of test that, we have to reverse them a little bit.
I think that I think we're in a slightly safer place, I think, to allow for those cross-examinations and to look at what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. I will say, though, as things are equalizing and getting better, you know, we have to keep remembering that for women of color and certainly trans women, that is absolutely not the case, not even close. Their equality, whether it be healthcare, whether it be the safety of their bodies, their workplaces, is the lowest point of care in this country and certainly with this administration. And so while we can talk about how things are definitely changing, they're definitely different than they've ever been before, there is still so much, I think, work to be done. And so we're in this really interesting place where it's like part of our society is like, okay, we're starting to understand each other, and this shakeup, the magnitude of this of our culture and our country's like tectonic subconscious earthquake is devastating and really disorienting. And I think for men and women, there is a sense of like, for men, they're like, oh, my opinion doesn't matter. And women are like, oh, my opinion matters? Like, it's confusing, and it's really been hard. So there's that happening, but then there's also still, like, I think a large level of women identifying peoples that are not getting that same space. So there's kind of like two large conversions, while one of them is having this massive revolution. I think in some aspects, the other part is being left out of that conversation, which is why, you know, for me, it's always important to err towards the side of having the most difficult conversation in the work that I do, the thing that will create a dialogue. I've said it before, and I'll say it here, that I don't believe in monologues. I believe in dialogues, and I believe we have to hold this space for the hardest, most scariest conversations, whether that indicts ourselves or whether that indicts someone we love or a culture. And, you know, and part of that is re-examining through different lenses and trying to say, how can I get somebody that I don't relate to understand me, like in the most fundamental way?
I wanted to ask you about that, because you're like a pretty experienced combatant on Twitter, and I've seen you, you know, I've seen you, you seem pretty serene about it. I've seen you, you know, sort of like, you know, tussle, like, welcome to the Thunderdome, you know, be in conversation both with people you agree with and people you don't. And part of what's interesting about this book is that you didn't write an easy book. You wrote a hard book. You wrote a painful book. You wrote a book that I I think, challenges some of the pieties of the way we talk about rape and assault. I think every author, especially on Pub Date, has both dreams and fears.
Yeah.
And dreams in terms of how a book may touch people, and also fears in terms of what kind of reaction you'll get. And I wanted to ask you to be a little vulnerable up here tonight and to talk a little bit about your dreams and fears of people's reaction to this material on Twitter or anyplace else.
I'm like literally getting misty-eyed right now. I don't think I would feel that way. Also, it's just a testament to be sitting here with you. I feel like we have so much history in such a short amount of time. So, thank you. You know, I think I have the same fears that that many women do. The fear of sort of being pigeonholed, of being stuck in a place where you are, being assigned a place where you are and never being allowed to be outside of that, not knowing how to...
And is that place for you, like you're cast in such a classic feminist outline that you can't like deviate?
No, I'm saying further back.
Or is that like because you were famous when you were young and you were in Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants that people always think of you as little Amber Tamblyn?
Yeah, there's some of that, and there's some real trauma in that history, some very, very real trauma, but then also, you know, you that is carried, it will never not be carried into some of the work that I do, just in the sense of, you know, looking at myself from the lens that I know to be true, that I've always known to be true. I've just never known how to manifest it. All I could ever do was, you know, write the best things that I could write and hope that people took those things seriously. And there will always be a part of me that goes, you know, people don't see me for who I am, that sort of feels that way. And so, you know, anytime you are putting a piece of work like this, a thing that was one of the longest labors of my life, that was so difficult to write, it literally left my central nervous system destroyed to the point where I had to go like find out, you know, if I had rheumatoid arthritis and all of these different autoimmune diseases, because my arms would clench up and my whole arms would get numb and my neck would get numb. And, you know, my therapist would like to say that that was my cast breaking open, if you want to look at it through a metaphor, that this book was sort of a release of long-term anguish and feeling a sense of feeling diminished that was being released from my body, and telling a story on a macro lens while having so much of it, not in the literal sense of sexual assault and rape, but in the sense of being violated violently under other circumstances, whether emotionally or spiritually or, you know, I mean, pick one. That there is a sense of like breaking free of that. So the book was very challenging for me in some of those ways in writing it, and I had to take some breaks while writing it. You know, I had bilateral carpal tunnel and Decker vein syndrome in both hands for 10 months. And I had to go see a physical therapist who made these plastic gloves for me that had these like Velcro straps. And I had to wear them, and they force your thumb to stay in place. And so I could type like this, like with a couple little fingers, but then often I just couldn't type at all. And that was also just really hard because I had a newborn at that time, and so I couldn't really breastfeed. So eventually my milk dried up. So everything was sort of like cumulative in that sense. But that was really hard. At the same time, it allowed me to just fester and think about it for almost a year, the whole story of this book, to the point that when I actually sat down to write it, I wrote it in like 5 months, if not less, because I had thought about it for so many years. It had been just building up, and I had figured out all the places and all the things that were so important to me to express in it.
So tell me how much or how little you want to say, and either is fine, but because you did just mention feeling very traumatized in your youth, and it seems to be connected to your experience in show business, and you've told some stories, including in this piece, about men treating you very inappropriately in show business, how much are you willing to say about that? And again, I don't want to invade your privacy, but it seems to be such an important reference point for you when you talk about having been violated when you were younger. What do you mean?
Well, I think that the things that I experienced were, they were always different forms of being shut out of conversations or being boxed out of places in which I know my voice should exist, or being told under certain circumstances that I had to look a certain way or I was going to fail. I mean, in you know, no more plain terms than that. I at one point had an agent who had said to me, you know, after the second Sisterhood movie, had said, you know, the head of Warner Brothers called and was like, I think she's going to be a huge star, but she's got to lose some weight. Like, she's just got to tone up. And I think at that point I was like 128 pounds and I'm 5'7". And I remember my agent saying to me, she was a woman, saying to me, you have a real choice here. You can either be Nicole Kidman or you can be a character actress. And at that time I was like 21 years old. So if you look at that and if you use that as an example and imagine that over 2 decades, forms of that from when you're a child all the way up, it does something to you. That combined with playing different people for a living, you know, there's a lot happening there and it can be very traumatic in certain senses.
I wish we could talk about that all night, because for me, one of the revelations of the Weinstein reporting was understanding the way female actors and really successful female actors actually feel about the business. Megan and I are writing a book about the Weinstein investigation and the ensuing cultural shift, and that going back to sort of, you know, some of the early notes and interviews, I see that.
And there are probably women you talk to that you can't even, like, you know, that'll never come forward, that'll never talk about the things. Completely.
But understanding that people's real, I think intellectually we all knew that people's real experience of Hollywood was very different than what you see on a glossy magazine cover, but it's another thing to learn the particulars.
Oh, yes.
So before we go to audience questions,
commercial break,
I want to ask you to read one of my favorite parts of the book. So I'm going to try to set this up correctly. So I don't think we're spoiling anything in the plot to say that this female rapist repeatedly terrorizes, assaults, is very violent towards people, and this, of course, becomes a kind of national preoccupation. And, you know, all of us, the American public, become very caught up in the story of who is this woman and why is she doing it, and the commentary ranges from the serious to the sensationalistic. So to convey this, you wrote a series of tweets from different sources.
Yes.
And then you also did something very smart, which I'm going to ask you to include this in your reading. You noted how popular each tweet was, how many retweets and replies it got. So what I did is I put check marks.
I see your check marks
next to the ones. What I did is I left the tweets out that I thought would ruin anything, and that are also attributed to characters that the audience doesn't necessarily know. These tweets are mostly attributed to people and places you do know. So would you read? I think we've got 4 pages worth of them.
Okay. So I just will preface that right before this is a sort of Nancy Grace type character that is has a panel and they're discussing men being raped and whether or not it's even possible for that to happen, and sort of really callously objectifying them in a certain way. And then one of the last panelists is a social media commentator, and so the character Melissa says, like, tell us what's going on in America. How is the Twitter sphere dealing with everything, with all this uncertainty? My heart breaks for the hashtag mod to penetrate victims and their families, sending so much love and prayers and strength. Taylor Swift.
Oh, and we should say the female rapist's name is Maud, so that's why you see that hashtag.
In a court of law, the term that's used for men who are sexually assaulted, whether by a woman or a man, is made to penetrate, which I think is just such a bizarre, fascinating term. So in this, Melissa Hope, this character coins the hashtag #ModToPenetrate. So that was from Taylor Swift. And you want me to read also all the, like, how many?
Yeah.
Okie dokie. 685 comments, 56,000 retweets, 742,000 likes. Conflicted about hashtag #ModToPenetrate. Why was this married father of two drinking with a random woman in the first place? Meghan McCain. 229 comments, 676 retweets, 2,500 likes. Controversial writer, blogger, and #ModToPenetrate victim Sebastian White is writing a book, and we are equally horrified and thrilled. Jezebel. 23,000 comments, 86,000 retweets, 171,000 likes. When it comes to violence against men, some people are actually saying what many have been thinking. Men are getting what they deserve. Inside the bizarre world of Modsters, Bitch Magazine. And that's sort of like a cult that starts following her. 64 comments, 301 retweets, 609 likes. Read my latest piece in The Atlantic on the brewing cult calling themselves the Modsters and how generations of violence and abuse against women has inevitably led to this moment. Hashtag #ModToPenetrate. Jill Fitzpatrick. 115 comments, 610 retweets, 1,000 likes. Young woman drugged and raped on university campus. Authorities are looking for a white male in his early 20s. Contact the Chicago police. Chicago Tribune. 1 comment, 0 retweets, 1 like. False. Hashtag #ModToPenetrate is not part animal, at least not that we know of. Snopes. 1.5 thousand comments, 44,000 retweets, 200,000 likes. Can a man be raped? Some say not possible. Join the hashtag #ModToPenetrate debate tonight on Facebook Live. Facebook, 46,000 comments, 100,000 retweets, 885,000 likes. Yes, men can get raped. There is no #ModToPenetrate debate, only rape. Teen Vogue. 2.9 thousand comments, 12,000 retweets, 200,000 likes. My new album is written for the victims of #ModToPenetrate. Donate to my Kickstarter fund today, Amanda Palmer. 2.9 thousand comments, 8,000 retweets, 12,000 likes. Is that it?
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
We'll save the rest for the
It
audience.
goes something like that. There's a lot more that happens in there. It gets pretty morbid.
So I think the last thing I wanted to ask you about before we turn the page to the audience is that you're really involved in Time's Up, which is started as a sort of, Hollywood-based movement, but it's grown way beyond Hollywood. That's essentially not only about combating sexual harassment and assault, but really fundamentally about equality. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you to kind of tell your story of Time's Up involvement and also tell us a little bit about what's going on now with those efforts.
So Time's Up was basically a lot of very angry women got in rooms together and said, how are we going to change this? I've said before that it was sort of women were angry and organized, so we were angrenized, sort of the term I've used to describe this effort. And for us, looking at the Me Too movement, we said, how can we create something that is action-based so that no woman or man ever has to say, Me Too again? And part of that was this discussion of, what can we do, but what can we say out there in the world, but what can we connect it to that's actionable? And so I remember that there was a letter that came out from the women of the Farm Workers Union. If you've never read it, you should. It's extraordinary. Over 700 women at that time signed a letter after the Weinstein case had broke, after the Me Too movement had broken open, and they said, we stand with you. We stand with the women in the entertainment business. And I remember it was brought to several of our attention, and there was a real feeling of, we need to respond to this, but we need to not just respond, it needs to be tied with an action. And so, while it's true that it did start with some women in the entertainment business, it absolutely also started with women who are not in the entertainment business. It started with some women that work in the Farm Workers Union, that work in the restaurant business, that work in tech, lawyers. It was women were angrenized across industries. And so we all sort of put our heads together and said, what can we do that is truly effective? And that's when we said, we'll tie this letter that we're going to send out with what became the Legal Defense Fund. And we ended up raising over $30 million, which goes towards helping to stop and make sure that there is no more assault or harassment in the workplace for both men and women. So right now, I think that there are a little over 300 cases that they've actually assigned that are now going out, and they're across industries, and there are lawyers assigned to start working on those cases.
And where do you think, if we could predict, where do you think Time's Up will be in 5 years? What do you think it'll become? Because what's interesting about Time's Up, in part, is that it was kind of born overnight, right?
It was, yeah.
It was born really, really fast. There was no organizational infrastructure. There was no single leader. It was a coalition of women. Right. And so it's still very much in the process of kind of becoming.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure when you go to those meetings, there are a lot of different ideas in the room about, it could be this, it could be this.
Yeah.
What's the Amber version? If you could have it go in the direction that you envision, what do you think it could become?
One of the most beautiful things about Time's Up, the experience of being a part of the inception of this particular organization, which I do believe is going to become global and bigger and more powerful in the best possible ways. One of the most beautiful things about it was that it was the first time ever that I had really experienced true inclusion as far as who is missing from the conversation that we were having in this room. Meaning, when we were sitting down and talking and going, okay, we feel this way, and there's these, lawyers that have this information, and there's these activists that have these information, but we're all white. So this doesn't work. So we have to find women of color. We have to find, trans women. We have to think outside of our spaces, different socioeconomical backgrounds. It has to be inclusive. And that is the rule within Time's Up and the work that's done there. And that was a beautiful aspect of it to me, and something that I carry with me outside of any association with Time's Up, is just to say, I go out into the world now, and that is a part of my daily living. It's not just the conversation, but it is always, wondering whose voice is not being represented in any particular room. And I really love that about the work that they're doing.
So I think, by the way, you just answered one of the audience questions about women of color. So just to sort of finish the thought, I think what you're saying is that what you want Time's Up to be is a truly inclusive, diverse movement.
It is.
Yeah. But to continue to fulfill
yes, to
that
continue
mission.
to fulfill that. But I also, one of the beautiful things about Time's Up was that you're right. It was women who just said, we're going to do this thing. We're just going to go do it. We're not asking anyone. We're saying this is the new rule. And, we encourage people from other countries. There are so many women that have reached out from other countries and said, we need something like this. And we're like, do it, Go out and do it. And this is the time, I think, for women and some men as well to just take the action into their own hands and say, how can we change our own communities, the faces of our communities, and the voices and the narratives of our communities.
But I want to continue to push you a little bit on the question of what you think can be accomplished. And I'm going to use another audience question to do it. Someone wrote, I think, a really great question, which is, what do you think it is about the culture in Hollywood that makes sexual abuse so common? And then I want to add a kind of variation on that question, which is to say, do you think sexual abuse in Hollywood can actually end? Because this is an industry in which the casting couch was an element from the beginning. Yeah. It was almost endemic to what Hollywood was, and that's part of what is actually so radical about what's happened and what's happening. But one of the big questions we've had at the paper is, how far does this go? Is sexual harassment and abuse in Hollywood or anywhere, but let's take Hollywood, is it essentially a problem that has to be managed better and diminished in an incremental way? Or can there be a funeral pyre for the casting couch where it gets burned and it goes up in flames, and except for maybe, you know, a couple of bad actors and outliers here and there, you can really say this is a completely unacceptable way of treating people. And there's kind of a social paradigm shift where people say, no, this, you know, saying that if you want the part, you have to sleep with me first, that is like beyond the pale.
So it's a really good question. We are definitely not there. It's going to take a long time. These things cannot happen overnight, and I think one of the problems with our culture is we have such a short attention span, and so we want things immediately. And this type of systemic change for a business that's been around for over 100 years won't happen overnight, and it's going to really take our patience and our persistence and an unwillingness to waver on what we believe the change must be. And believe me, this is, you know, they'll wait us out. They're betting on our exhaustion. They're betting.
Who do you think they is?
I think anybody in Hollywood, woman, man, anybody that is that doesn't like this movement, that talks about these things of like you can't flirt in the workplace, you can't do these things. Anyone that is pushing back, that is resisting against what this has been. I'm talking about those people in particular. And there's this real sense, I think, of, you know, actors who are problematic being told to just go be quiet for a while and let it, you know, cool off, and then you can come back and everyone will have forgotten, because you know what? It's possible they will. And so we have to remember. And I think it's our job to continuously push the envelope and to continuously, you know, to speak about it and talk about what the problems are, and to know that this stuff cannot change overnight, but with real persistence and patience, you know, and direct action, that it is possible over time.
What is your estimation of how much Hollywood has actually changed? Like, do you think somewhere in Hollywood right now, there's some 17-year-old girl who's being pressured into doing something she does not want to do?
Absolutely.
Because she feels it's the only way to succeed
Absolutely.
in Hollywood? You
yes.
do?
Oh, 100%. Yes, I have friends who I know who are experiencing some pretty brutal stuff right now. It's still happening.
So what would you say has changed in the last 8 months?
I would say that the dialogue has started. We didn't even have that before. We didn't even have a space to talk about it. And in the talking about it, you know, we are opening space for there to be change. And I think that is crucial. I think that's a really, really big part of it. And, you know, a lot of action now is coming out of this place of fear, of this sense of, like we said, like you can't flirt, like what do you know, all of these different things. I don't even know if, I've heard things about like, I don't even know if I want to bring women into the office place. Like I'm not going to hire them anymore. I'm not going to talk to them. I'm not going to work with them because X, Y, or Z. It's like, you know what? That's not the answer. That's just going to make things even worse. And to me, it's about, again, holding the space, if we can, to have the hard conversations, whether that's, you know, with men who are our bosses, with women who are, you know, allying with problematic men and saying, I refuse to see this. Whatever the conversation is, to make sure that there is space to have it, and then to force yourself to have it, even if it makes you sick to your stomach.
So we got a really interesting hypothetical from the audience. And I have to tell you, hypotheticals are so hard for reporters because we're so trained in fact, and it's really hard for us to depart from the way things actually happened. But I'm going to read it because it's really interesting, and I think gets to deeper questions about why things played out the way they did. Do you, which I think means both of us, think that the Access Hollywood tapes would have had a greater impact if it had followed the Me Too movement?
That is a good question.
So let's play it out this way. Let's write a little fiction right here on stage. Let's say that we had broken the Bill O'Reilly and Harvey Weinstein stories in the summer of 2016 during the presidential race. Might have caused some problems for Bill Clinton. Might have caused a lot of conversation about that, but might have caused even more problems for Donald Trump. And let's say the Access Hollywood tape had been positioned, let's say the Me Too movement had played out in a way where not only was it, you know, this media figure and that TV host and this studio head who were being fired, but then boom, the Access Hollywood tape came out and we discovered that even the Republican nominee for president had said these things. And then I think I would complicate the question by saying, would the outcome of the election would it have been different? But also, would the outcome of the Me Too movement have been different if that had happened?
I kind of want to know what your thoughts are on that.
I'll tell you exactly. I'll tell you. Well, I don't know if I can get into the twist plot of, you know, what would have happened, but I can tell you something that Megan and I believe very firmly based on the reporting we've lived, which is that it is, in a sense, easier to focus on the substantive issues when it comes to harassment and assault when you're not writing about politics and you're not writing about a Donald Trump or a Bill Clinton or an Al Franken or anybody like that. And here's why. Part of the reason why we think this reporting had so much power is that it was totally bipartisan, right? The Times did the Bill O'Reilly story in April of 2017 and the Harvey Weinstein story in October of 2017. And so the message from that combination is, this is everywhere. This is not a partisan issue. It's on the right and the left. And there were obviously a lot of the most important harassment and assault stories are political. Clarence Thomas, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, these are obviously hugely important allegations. But what happens with the way they play out in political life is that they get weaponized politically, and they become part of, you know, an ever greater and ever deafening partisan war. And what people think of a Donald Trump or a Bill Clinton, I think, does tend to color what they think of the allegations and how they handle them. So for us, I think it was cleaner and more effective and more powerful in some way that we were writing about the right and the left, and we were writing about a lot of figures who, like, you know, a Louis C.K. is not sort of essentially a political figure at all.
Yeah.
So as you can see, I've sort of answered the question.
You did. You did a really good job, actually.
Yeah. So I think what I'm saying is that my suspicion is that if it played out this way, I think there is a possibility that Me Too would have hit a dead stop because it would have become all about presidential politics and not, like in some sense, not about the common threads of the experience that we see on every side.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it would have influenced. It's impossible to say. It's impossible to say because there are too many factors. But, you know, the Access Hollywood tape broke a month before Donald Trump was elected. You couldn't hide from that news. Everybody knew it.
And then he still got elected.
So people who voted for him knowing exactly what he said on that tape.
Yeah.
So over to you.
Yeah, I completely agree with the latter, or with the former, and this idea that, you know, he still got elected no matter what. And I think that in the face of what had happened was clearly very, very directly related to this sense of, okay, that's it. We've had it. I also think, though, you know, a lot of people speculate that the Me Too movement and that avalanche, as you called it earlier in our conversation, was directly created and affected by his election. And I actually think it's kind of directly related to Hillary Clinton's loss, and the sense that, you know, to look at someone like that, and collectively, I think for a lot of women, not all women, but a lot of them felt like this woman is, you know, while not perfect and clearly flawed in many, many ways, is absolutely exceptional and perfect for this job, and she still lost in the face of that. And not only did she lose, she was demeaned at every turn, whether it was talking about her health, whether it was that debate I just mentioned, whether it was, creating these sort of archaic, disgusting cartoons and magazines portraying her as like a fat man-eating pantsuit-wearing monster, talk about the folklore that I had mentioned earlier. And I think that there was a real, I knew for me, an interior revolt and a sense of this can't happen anymore. This can't happen to one of us anymore. And certainly if it can happen to the most powerful one, then it is happening to all of us. And so I actually believe that the Me Too movement was more pushed through, and even the Women's March was a response to that, slightly more than Donald Trump winning the presidency.
So I hear you, and I think the other thing it was a response to, and the other thing it grew out of, was women having just enough power in the workplace to say, we're not going to put up with this anymore. I think if you look at
that's part of the chain.
The historic progression and the sort of, look, women have always worked in this country, especially lower income women. I mean, domestic workers, laundresses, a lot of these people were women over time. But what you have over the course of, really just many of our lives and our mothers' lives is this dramatic influx of women into universities, into the professions, claiming, responsible for more of the household income than ever before, the rise of two-career families. And I think that the Me Too movement is an opportunity for women to say, as my friend, the writer Dahlia Lithwick puts it, we are not the dessert cart. Meaning, we didn't come to the workplace to, maybe we'll meet a guy there, fine. but we came here with our professionalism, our hard work, our economic desire, our need to make $10 an hour, whatever it is. And that's actually the primary reason we're here. We're not here to, do whatever it is that that you want to do otherwise. And I think that would have been, there were brave women who said that 40 years ago, but it was a harder thing to say back then. It was more like this world existed with its rules that seemed immutable, and you had to put up with them.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, so we have more questions, but I also need someone from the Y to tell us when we are finally out of time tonight, because otherwise I could...
You guys know this is a 24-hour conversation.
Exactly.
Who brought their sleeping bags?
Okay, so I'm just trusting that somebody will give us a 2-minute warning when it's time to wrap up. Okay, what do we think the lawyers who protect men, both abusing their power and the legal system, and further victimizing the women, will be called to task? I think what this questioner is referring to is that there are a lot of lawyers who seem complicit, in a sense, in sexual harassment or assault, who have actively been involved in helping to silence victims. They might characterize their work very differently, but I think what this questioner is asking is there something really problematic about what they've done, and will they face any consequences?
That's hard to say, but I imagine, I have seen, especially with friends of mine and some of the work that I've done, tremendous amounts of suppression and pressure and attempts at silencing women in ways that are pretty terrifying. And the legal world seems so complicated to me, and it's something that I'm not a lawyer. I see it from the lens that I'm able to see it through with, doing work within Time's Up. But I hope that they do. My only hope is that they do, but I don't know what that would actually look like or what that would take for it to happen, because in some ways I think that lawyers are outfitted with some of the most serious weapons that we have.
Say more about the kind of legal pressure that your friends have faced? You mean they'll get a phone call from a lawyer saying,
Oh,
like, you
yeah,
have to sign-
intimidation. I mean, just straightforward intimidation. The kinds of things also that you see that, Ronan Farrow reported, that people like Rose McGowan were going through as far as being, followed and, having these spies like following them around and making them really have a sense of paranoia and feeling like their lives are being threatened. I think even on a simple, on a simple level as that, there's a very public case going on right now between Brett Ratner and Melanie Kolner. I'm not speaking out of turn. This is all public knowledge, but there's a lot of pressure there.
We should tell people what happened, which is basically in the first few weeks of the Me Too movement, Melanie posted something on Facebook saying, I think in essence, Brett Ratner
assaulted her.
And the post, I believe, was taken down, and I think he sued her.
Yeah, he's currently suing her for
right.
defamation. I believe it's defamation. But the, tactics like that of just saying that this is not just about I'm going to, fill up your bank account with so many legal bills that you can't even pay it anymore. Just part of the point, I think, that some of these lawyers are doing this. It's also just to send a message. I think in a certain way they're also saying, you want to come forward and accuse someone? This is what it's going to look like. This is what your life is going to look like. That's scary.
So I think the answer to this question about whether lawyers will be called to account depends on what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because some of the tactics you just mentioned are very outside the boundaries of kind of conventional accepted practice. Like, for example, Harvey Weinstein did, through David Boies, hire Black Cube, this Israeli intelligence firm that tried to dupe me, among other people.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so that is something that is, generally considered way outside the boundaries of fair play. But then there are other forms of what we could call either legal intimidation or conventional legal practice. I think one of the areas that's most intensely debated among the people who are following this is the settlement system, and whether we should have a system in this country where women accept money, sometimes large sums of money, in exchange for their silence. And it's really hard to say because some of the women want those agreements. They say that money is really their only recompense that they can have. They say that they want their privacy and they don't want to speak out. Yeah. But what we've also seen in our reporting is that these settlements can be really enabling for alleged perpetrators.
Especially if they've done it more than once, which most of them do.
Well, my colleagues Emily Steele and Mike Schmidt have reported that Bill O'Reilly and Fox spent a total of $45 million to silence allegations of inappropriate conduct by Bill O'Reilly towards women. That is a really enormous amount of money.
Yeah, that's pretty
so. If this,
horrifying.
I think the question for the audience is, if your daughter had, what we in newspaper terms called an allegation, if she had a really upsetting experience in the workplace and she thought she had a legal case, would you want her in a situation where she could accept money, maybe a large sum of money, in exchange for signing a confidentiality agreement saying that she wouldn't tell anybody what happened? Now, on the one hand, it can seem to provide a kind of clean escape from the situation. On the other hand, she's really promising not to tell anybody. She's promising not to tell anybody even if she finds out that other women are victimized, even if she decides that, part of her way of processing this experience is that years later she has to speak out. She is, in some cases, promising that she won't tell future children about what happened to her. The confidentiality provisions can be really extreme. And so that's kind of a debate that I think we all need to collectively have.
Yeah, it's deeply personal, and I think for each woman it's very different,
Okay, great. Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay, give us the ideal version of what we have 2 minutes left.
I wish you just like jumped. You were like, "What is your favorite rom-com?"
Just like, we can certainly.
It's 27 Dresses.
We can certainly do that, but I think the thing I want to end on is I want to mention something that you told me in the green room, which is that you're about to take this book and you are going on a 35.
Yeah, somewhere between like 30 and 35, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is for people who don't know the book business, that is on the intense end for an author tour. So basically, you're going to be involved in a months-long public conversation.
Yeah, 2 months through the end of August.
About these issues. So during your summer of any man, what are the conversations you most want to have?
Oh boy, I'm prepared for them. I've taken a lot of time to relax before this book came out, just sort of in preparation and knowing that it's going to be many things. It's going to be, I think, triggering for a lot of people, really upsetting. I think it's also going to, I hope it's going to probably bring up a lot and people will want to talk about it and possibly even maybe talk about some of their own experiences. I have had, in the process of a couple men who I asked to read this book before I gave it to my, the first pass to my editors, I asked 3 straight men, friends of mine, and I said, does this feel real to you? Do these voices feel real? Is there anything here that I'm missing? And 2 out of those 3 men told me that they had been sexually assaulted by women.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you had no idea?
I had no idea, and one of them is a long-term friend. I've known him for a very long time. The other one I've known for a couple years.
Wow.
Yeah, so I'm prepared for that too, and I'm open for that,
Well, I used to be an editor, not a reporter, and I would say after your summer of Any Man, if the result of you publicizing this book is that you hear a lot of stories about men's experiences of sexual assaults and being victims, I'd like to read your next New York Times opinion column about that.
Fair enough.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jodi. Thank everyone here.